where are we up to? We now saw three, what I would call major areas of evidence for the truth of the Torah, reason for believing. One is a prediction of conquest, exile, dispersal, survival, and return. And one is the evidence that the revelation of Sinai is a real historical event. And the other is the utter bankruptcy of explaining Jewish survival in naturalistic terms. There's one other area of evidence that I want to mention to you. I think I don't give it too much weight, but I guess you could decide for yourself how much weight it ought to get. I think it could be argued that Judaism has had as big or bigger impact on world development than any other culture from ancient times. There are cultures that had a big impact. Greece, which created a certain type of philosophical thinking, a certain type of mathematical thinking and scientific thinking, which has had a tremendous effect on the world. Of course, the particular theories they believed in are out of date. Nobody goes back to Aristotle to figure out how plants grow or how rain falls and so forth and so on, but they played a developmental part. The Romans developed law to a very great extent. If you take a look at the world over the last 3,000 years and compare the world culture with Jewish culture, I think you can see a steady march in our direction over 3,000 years. First of all, 3,000 years ago, everyone was polytheist. The only monotheists in the world were Jews. Today, more than 40% of the world's population is Christian, Muslim, and a few Jews. And even though a sizable part of the so-called Christian world is post-Christian, they aren't polytheists. That means for a great percentage of the world, polytheism simply died out. It died out. We are the ones who represented the monotheistic idea. And then, of course, it was translated outwards by the Christians and translated outwards by the Muslims. But it was our idea. And I think if you go back, let's say 2,100 years to before Christianity started, and you take a look at world culture and ask, where do you think the world's going to be 1,000 years from now or 2,000 years from now? Which ancient culture is going to be strongly represented in the world 1,000 years from now or 2,000, and which cultures are going to die out and disappear? I think that Judaism would have been one of the chief candidates of dying out and disappearing. From the ancient point of view, Judaism was lazy, wasteful, stupid, superstitious. You say you believe in a God, but it has no physical form? You're lying. You're lying. Everything has a physical form. It's just a stupid contradiction, or you're pretending. Makes no sense. We were accused by the Greeks who knew us of atheism, because if you don't have a statue, you don't have a physical form, there's nothing there. You say there is, but it doesn't have a form. That's like saying it's a square circle. You have a holiday every 7 days. Every 7 days? You're just lazy. You just don't want to work. No culture had a stoppage of work every 7 days. They looked at us as, the things we don't eat. And, what's wrong with snails? What's wrong with ants? The French eat chocolate-covered ants. Right? And so on and so on. We would have been voted one of the least likely to survive. It's astonishing that the United Nations, its original building in New York, has a cornerstone. You know what's etched onto that cornerstone? A verse from the book of Isaiah. From our book. We're still 0.001% of the world population. How could it be for a world of billions of people? The one book from which they choose their foundation stone is our book. Why not from Plato? Why not from Aristotle? Why not from the Roman thinkers who built the Western world and all that? No, because that book is still relevant. It's still having effect. It's not just developmental like Greek science and Greek mathematics and so forth and so on. No, it's still having a direct effect. The values of justice come from the prophets. Very interesting. I don't know if you've heard of civil disobedience. In the United States, civil disobedience is a very important social idea. And it's a quite subtle idea. The idea that sometimes you can do crimes and be punished for them and earn respect. Because you're doing the crime to illustrate your opposition to a certain social policy, and you're willing to pay for it. You're willing to go to jail for it. The very fact that you're willing to go to jail shows the seriousness, and people then take it seriously. They start thinking about it and debating it in more serious terms. You call attention to it. Here's a place where a person who strictly speaking is a criminal because he broke a law and goes to jail, earns respect. I saw an article by a historian. The only place you can find such an idea in the ancient world is in Judaism. Because in Judaism, the prophet can say to the king, "You're a sinner." In no other ancient culture could you do that. The kings were divine. You couldn't fight with the king. You can get respect by fighting with the king. Civil disobedience, which was practiced in the United States by Martin Luther King and others, and by students in the 70s, has its roots only in Judaism. So the influence of Judaism on the development of world culture can be argued to be as large or larger than any other ancient culture. Now, like we said in the other three cases, you'd have to explain that. If we had an empire and conquered the whole of the Mediterranean basin, say, look, we conquered, we took over other nations, we imbued them with our culture and by our armies, and we had them under our thumb for 100 years, 200 years, so of course we made an impact. We impressed it on the world, like the Romans did with their armies. We didn't do that. Or if we attracted world attention with our superb mathematics, or agriculture, or military, or ceramics, or whatever, and then we gained international respect. But none of that happened. None of that happened. It's not at all obvious why this little group should have such a gigantic impact on the development of world culture. I think that's, number one, it's a piece of evidence for something special going on here, not natural. And also it's going to contribute to the way in which we frame the explanation of the evidence. But that's another piece of evidence that I think you can appreciate directly. There's a fifth piece, which I can't do with you at a time. In my writings, I have this documented with lots of footnotes. But it can be argued that the quality of life that Jews have experienced and enjoyed is uniquely high throughout history. But I'm not going to do that now. I'm just mentioning it to you. If you want to see it, you can write me an email and I can show you all the information. So we have 4 areas of evidence, 3 of which I did describe in great detail, 1 of which I mentioned today. The 5th I'm going to leave out, just mentioned it, I'm going to leave it out. The question now is how to explain the evidence. How to explain it. You have a prediction of extremely unlikely events which came true. You have a mass revelation. You have the survival of the Jewish people. You have the impact of the Jewish people on the rest of world culture. How to explain that? If, as I've argued in detail, a natural explanation is not forthcoming, then you need to look for something else. Now, the next step is to ask, what's the minimal explanation that we need to explain these things? Don't go any further beyond, don't extrapolate, just the minimal explanation. Well, if you have a prediction of things that in other terms are extremely unlikely to happen, they all happen, then the source of prediction has to have information about the future. Information that we can't account for in natural terms. As I said then, it could be that this source produces the future, so it knows its own intentions. That's how it knows what's going to happen. Or some other way of knowing what's going to happen in the future. Whatever it is, it has that ability. If you have a relation at Sinai, it means 3 million people here have an experience with identical content and in ways that the natural world can't explain. Whatever this cause is, it's behind that experience. survival of a people? We don't know how to survive. Cultures don't know how to survive. If they did, they wouldn't die out. All the cultures from the ancient world have died out or been so transformed that they aren't the same culture. So, almost all. So, to preserve a culture against all odds, in circumstances where the culture should have disappeared, as Art showed you in detail, requires considerable intelligence. It requires enough power to manipulate the circumstances to enable survival to take place. Same is true with worldwide impact. Why should your culture be the one that has a worldwide impact when you are an insignificant puff of population with nothing to recommend you? Behind this, you have to have an agent that possesses information about the future or power of the future, the ability to pull off the experience at Sinai, the ability to preserve a culture, which requires intelligence and some leverage, and the ability to infuse this culture with the materials that will eventually affect people in certain ways or manipulate the other people to be affected by it, one or the other. Those are all descriptions of what Judaism calls God. Judaism has lots of more descriptions about God, more powerful descriptions about God, but this minimum description of God, I claim, can be read straight off the evidence. You have to have this, otherwise you can't explain the evidence at all. So this much is something which you can read off the evidence. And in particular, you can read off the evidence some of the purposes of this agent. Number one, this agent must care a lot about the Jews because the vast majority of his input is in terms of Jewish history. And also, he's got to care about the rest of mankind because otherwise he could put us on a South Sea island, totally isolated, and preserve us and let mankind develop in its own way. No, he put us at the crossroads of 3 continents where every conqueror in our area would march to our backyard and where we had a gigantic impact on the rest of the world. So that means that this agent has a concern for all of mankind, not just for Jews. All of these are cardinal Jewish beliefs. And these cardinal Jewish beliefs, I think, can be read straight off the evidence. Then the question will become, what about the rest of Judaism? There's an awful lot more to Judaism than just these cardinal beliefs, that God created the universe out of nothing, and that he's infinite, and so on and so on. These can't be read directly off the information. I think the right answer to that question is this. I used to put it in a certain incorrect way, and about 10 years ago a student pointed out that I was making a mistake, and I had to change it because of that. So I'll try to be careful to explain it to you in such a way that I don't make the same mistake. Let's say you have a body of information, a theory, and you want to test it. How do you test it? Well, the theory says A, B, C, D, so go check that A is correct, go check that B is correct, go check that C is correct, go check that D is correct. And when you see they're all correct, then you know it's correct. That's great. It works about 1/100th of 1% of the time. Usually, when you're trying to check a theory, you can't check all of it. It's not possible to check all of it. You check fragments of it. Take Newton's law of gravitation. Newton's law of gravitation says that gravity works in a certain way everywhere, every when. The whole of the universe, everywhere. How much of that can you check? Can you take a trip to Alpha Centauri and see whether it works there? Probably not. Can you go back year by year for the last 13.8 billion years? No, probably not. What about the future? Can't check that at all. So what do? You can't check all of it. So what do? You check pieces. And as Richard Feynman points out, you try to be as non-prejudiced in the pieces you check as possible. Check different areas of the sky with no particular pattern. Check years going back with no particular pattern, so-called randomly. If you get consistent results, then you have reason to accept the whole. Even though you haven't checked the whole, you have reason to accept the whole. That's how it's done in science. And for some of you, science is spelled with all capital letters and 24-point letters and, in Gothic print and red. because that's the standard. Well, that's the way it's done in science. Sampling. What is sampling? Statistical sampling. By the way, you know why the projections for elections are so terrible recently? I read an article which explains it, and it's doomed. It's doomed because sampling for political opinions is done through landline telephones, randomized. In the United States of America, something like 45% of homes have no landline. They only have cell phones. Cell phone calls cost a lot. Landline calls are free. The companies that survey 10,000 people don't make 10,000 cell phone calls. They don't make any cell phone calls. They only make landline calls. That's a gigantic bias in the sampling of the population. And as it continues to grow, that people don't have landlines, the samples are going to be lousy. They're going to go off the tracks. But you do have statistical sampling, like, for example, in checking drugs against disease, right? Where you gather information and you're supposed to be able to tell whether this drug has an effect on the disease, to improve it or not to improve the outcome of the course of the disease. All these are uses of techniques to gather evidence where you don't check the whole thing. You don't check the whole thing. So somebody says, look, you have evidence for these particular pieces of Judaism, but what about the rest? One should start by pointing out that that's the standard position in everything else in life. When you're trying to figure out whether to accept a theory or a proposition or a philosophy or an attitude, you don't check everything. You check some sample and then you make up your mind about the rest. Now, what's crucial, and this is where I made my mistake until the student corrected me, what's crucial is to ask, what kind of information are we sampling and what kind of conclusion are we drawing? Here's the example that the student gave me, which I think was devastating. Take the New York Times. Shall I sample its pages and draw a conclusion about its general credibility? Probably not, because if you take the sports pages, which report the sports scores from yesterday, they're going to be very accurate. If you take the report of the readings of the Dow Jones Industrials and the other stocks, it's going to be very accurate. If you take the op-ed page, it's going to be mostly junk. And if you take political strategy pages, you'll have a mixed bag. So you have to make sure when you're sampling information and drawing a conclusion about the whole, you have to make sure that the information is unified in some way, that it's integrated in some way, so that a sampling will give you a right to draw a conclusion about the whole. If what you're sampling is the New York Times, you take all your samples from the sports pages and you're going to draw a conclusion about the op-eds, it's just apples and oranges. They're not related to one another. So the question then is, how integrated, organized, connected is the Jewish information that we're sampling? If I would take Newton's law of gravity on one extreme and say it's 100, there's a standard of 100, organized, integrated, it's one statement, one simple statement which is supposed to apply in exactly the same way everywhere. And on the other end, I'll take the New York Times, give it a 0, and I put Jewish information in between, I would put it around 80. I put it around 80 because the Jewish picture of the world has a single theme, a single, simple, integrated theme. There's a creator. He created the universe in order to express his goodness. The whole of history is developed in order to maximize the goodness that he can project. That's the theme of the whole story. Everything else is details. How it's accomplished, when it's accomplished, what plays off against what has priorities over what, but it's a single story. Not like, for example, polytheism, where you have different powers, and different powers have different projects, different goals, and they fight with one another. That story is very complex. Gathering evidence for the fact that these 6 gods are operative doesn't give you evidence that those 4 gods are operative. They're different powers with under different control. But there's a unified story. And therefore, if it's got good integration, not maximal, but good integration, then sampling the story at different places where you can test it and finding that it's confirmed gives evidence to the rest, especially since there are no samples which you can show are mistakes. So you have a sampling where some confirm and some aren't testable because they deal with things that are either beyond our ability to get information about, or they deal with the future. That being the case, I would say the parts of Judaism that are read right off the evidence are parts for which you have very strong support. The rest of it gets support because it's integrated. It's one integrated body of information, and it gets some support. And at this point, I believe the right attitude is we have support. For parts, we have strong support. For parts, we have indirect and some support. Let's hear the critics. Let's see if the critics can show mistakes. If they can't show any credible mistakes, and I believe that's the case, and I have dealt at great length with supposed critics, then in the meantime, I think we have adequate reason to accept the story as true. Always open to the next critique, open to the next objection, to the newest, crushing defeat, which the New York Times thinks up, every Monday and Thursday, and deal with it as we go along. I think taking everything into account, we have adequate reason to accept that the Torah is true. That's the conclusion that I wanted to draw. Now, some people, are there questions about what I just said now in the last 15 minutes? Yeah.
So if you're trying to apply the scientific method to proving that there's adequate reason to believe, right?
Not prove. If you were here from the beginning, I never use that word. I think it's the wrong word to use. That there is adequate reason to believe. That's right.
But then part of that requires that it is testable. So the fact that there's parts that aren't testable means you can't really use that method.
No, I wouldn't say that. After all, think of gravity. Is gravity part of science?
Yeah.
It's kosher, right? It's an accepted part of science. But you can't test all of it. You can't test all of it. So should I simply ignore gravity on the grounds that I can't test all of it? Should I discount gravity for the parts I haven't tested yet? What about the future? I haven't tested the future at all. Shall I count on gravity for the future, even though I haven't tested the future yet?
Yeah, but even with gravity, it doesn't really apply in all circumstances.
Oh, really? Publish it. You'll get a Nobel Prize. Nobody knows that. Gravity doesn't apply in all circumstances? Publish it.
Like on the microscopic scale, it doesn't apply anymore. That's like one of the big, I don't know, it's like that's not really.
Maybe what you're referring to is that quantum mechanics and relativity have no consistent application. That's true, but that just means neither of them is formulated clearly enough to know what it says, because they contradict one another. That doesn't mean it doesn't apply. There's no documented case where gravity doesn't apply. There's just cases where our two theories contradict one another and we have nothing to say. We're just talking nonsense. That's a problem. And by the way, the scientific community is divided, sort of divided, as which way to go. Most think that relativity is going to have to be modified. Roger Penrose thinks that quantum mechanics will have to be modified. Relativity will stay the same. Gravity will stay exactly the same. So that's not a case where gravity doesn't apply. But anyway, the point that I'm making is your claim was if you can't test it, then it's not within the scientific method to trust it. My point is that the scientific method tests portions, samples, and trusts it for the rest. Think of diseases. You take 1,000 people and you try out and if it increases the probability of survival or longevity, so then you recommend it for everybody. But you didn't test 300 million people, you tested 1,000 people.
This goes right back to what you were saying about the New York Times, about comparing apples and oranges. Just because there's some things that are testable, and there's totally different, like, it's not like the Bible is one uniform thing, it's just like the New York Times, like you were saying. So you can't compare those things that are untestable to things that are testable, because they're two completely separate. Just because they're all contained in the same book doesn't make...
Okay, that's the objection that I raised, right? And I answered it. Let's go back over my answer. I said it depends upon how integrated the information is. And I said the Torah is based on one simple story with one theme, and everything else is consequences of working out that theme. That seems to me that it's not at all like the New York Times. That's not at all like the New York Times. The sports scores and the op-eds are not instances of one simple theme. They're not all working out the consequences of one theme. Sports scores and the op-eds have nothing in common. So it's not like the New York Times at all. The one simple theme is there's a creator who created the world for the sake of a single purpose, and everything he's doing is to maximize the success of that purpose. That's one single story. Not like the New York Times at all. The idea of testability is very important. You don't test everything before you draw a scientific conclusion. You test a sample, you test related things, and you draw a conclusion on the things that you can't test. Can't test or haven't tested. Of course, you're waiting for refutations. You're open to the idea that something might make you change your mind. I expressed the same openness in our case. This isn't a demonstration. It isn't a proof that it has to be right. As I said, I don't use proof at all. But if the evidence leads you in that direction, and there are no solid counterexamples, then that's what you ought to accept until unless something else disturbs it. That's why I called it adequate reason. That's my term. Adequate reason to believe, not proof. Okay, now, some people ask if there really is adequate reason, and you've been explaining this in neutral terms, in philosophical terms, in logical terms, in scientific terms. How come more people don't agree with you? Where is everybody else? And I have a very intolerant, brutal attitude towards this. My attitude is, don't count people, count reasons. A billion people with one reason, count for one. One person who has three reasons counts for three. Don't count people, count reasons. And here's my brutal illustration of it. What are there more of in the world, Jews or anti-Semites? Is that a hard question? You have to really work on a survey to figure that out. There are at least hundreds of millions of anti-Semites, and maybe billions, right? Does that bother you? You find it hard to sleep at night? Maybe we really are evil. Maybe, because there's so many people who believe it. But of course you say, yeah, I know they believe it, but it's just prejudice. Why should I be bothered by the fact that there are hundreds of millions of people who are prejudiced? Quite right. That's quite right. Why are they prejudiced? Because they don't have reasons. So now you say to me, why aren't there more people who accept this reasoning and believe it? I don't know. Ask a psychologist. That's not my field. I want to know, do they have reasons against it? Let's hear the reasons. We'll deal with the reasons one by one. Like the new atheists, Dennett and Dawkins and Hitchens and the rest of them. So we've read their books, and their books have been refuted. They present what they think of as reasons, and we have shown that the reasons are not there. Not only we, but atheistic philosophers have shown that there are reasons and no reasons. If you present reasons, then we are bound to respond. The mere fact that there are a lot of people who disagree, so what? Don't let that bother you. Don't let that concern you. By the way, in her book, The War Against the Jews, Lucy Davidovitz documents that in the 1880s and 90s in Germany, there were universities which had fraternities, and in order to join the fraternity in the university, you had to sign a pledge that you were an anti-Semite. Now, these university students, presumably the top of the intelligentsia, but this was a little blick that they had. They had to be anti-Semites, in order to join. So I want reasons, not people, but reasons. My job as a philosopher in particular, I was a logician. I should say I am a logician. Is to deal with reasons, and that's what I spend my life doing, looking at the reasons for and against and trying to deal with the reasons that are against best I can. So don't be worried about the fact that lots of people don't agree. Now, when you look at people who pledge allegiance to the Jewish tradition, but who describe it in terms different from ours, when I was not born into a religious family, so I made the transition in and I crossed all the steps. We were Reform, and I went through a period where I was conservative, and experimented with Reconstructionist thinking and literature until I became Orthodox. I was modern Orthodox until I became Haredi. And the only thing that I've found that you can do is look at it and see whether it's true. Go through the sources as best you can. Become competent, become literate, spend the time to educate yourself, and go through the sources as best you can. There is a group which treats Jewish law as totally fluid. One of the members of that group coined the following very catchy phrase: where there's a rabbinic will, there's a halachic way. Halakha is the Hebrew term for Jewish law. If the rabbis want it, they can make it happen. Don't worry. They can figure out a way. They'll wave a flag, and they'll create a legal fiction. Whatever they want to do, they can do. Now, if you take a look superficially at certain Jewish institutions, and you don't know much, it can look like that. And I saw them, and they told them to me. But then I went and researched it. I looked into the original sources, and I found out that that's not the way it is at all. And there's no substitute to doing it one by one. I'll give you one example, just to show you what this is like. There's a law in the Torah which says that at the end of every 7 years, all debts are canceled. I shouldn't say all, but debts are canceled. Debts are canceled. Well, you don't think that Jews are going to take that lying down, do you? Come on, canceling debts? What kind of a society can you have? What kind of economy can you have? Hillel invented a document whereby you can collect. You can collect anyway. We just did it now before Rosh Hashanah. Everybody got witnesses to sign that document for us so we can collect. After all, it's extremely impractical. It's extremely impractical. So even though the Bible, God's word, says that the debts are canceled, the rabbis found a way to make sure that you can collect your money. If they can do that, they can do anything. They can allow a Kohen to marry a divorcee, and they can allow homosexual marriage, and they can allow going to the beach on buses on Shabbos, because it's all in their hands. And if they want to do it, they can make it happen. Okay, so I did some of the research on the subject. First of all, according to the majority of authorities, the biblical law isn't in force. It's written in the Bible, but it isn't in force. Because for it to be enforced, the majority of Jews have to be living in the land of Israel. And since the exile, that ain't true. And since it ain't true, the biblical law is not in force. What is there in place of that? A rabbinic law. The rabbis made a law to imitate the biblical law, but just as an imitation. Now, this rabbinic law is their creation. They made it. If they made it, they own it. If they own it, they can put in an escape clause. When they made the law to cancel debts in imitation of the biblical law, they said, but not if you sign the document. If you sign the document, you don't have to cancel the debt. Any problem there? Any slip of logic there? Any indication that you can wave a magic wand and eat pigs? I don't think so. I don't think so. And then you'll say, but what about the authorities who say that it's biblical? That's true. That's true. There are biblical authorities who say it's biblical. But it's also a biblical rule that the Jewish court can redistribute property as it pleases. It can take property and assign property and redistribute property as it pleases. That's a universally accepted principle of Jewish law. So the Jewish court comes along and says, A owes B money. The end of the 7th year comes along. The debt is canceled. It's canceled. The Torah says it's canceled. It's canceled. But we make an award to A of B's, or A owes B. We make an award to B of A's property equal to the original loan. And then he collects it on the basis of our award. Does that give you the feeling that if you wanted, the rabbis could let you eat pigs? I don't think so. I don't think so. The truth about the flexibility, plasticity of Jewish law is this, that in order to change a law, I'm speaking vaguely now. I'm speaking vaguely because I can't do everything at once. I'm just saying that especially for the recordings. You need 2 conditions to be met. Number one, I'll say slightly more precisely, in order to change practice. In order to change Jewish practice, you need 2 conditions to be met. Number one, you have to have an internal Torah motivation for the change, and you have to have the legal authority for the change. When both of those conditions are met, then the change could take place. Otherwise not, and that means you're not going to wave a flag and permit prigs. Let's go back to the debt. The Torah had a law that at the end of every 7 years, debts are canceled. Now, imagine someone who needs money. His house burned down. Somebody's sick. He needs money. It's 3 months from the cancellation date. He goes to a wealthy person. He says, listen, I'm stuck. I need money. The wealthy person says, yeah, I hear you, but what's going to be with my money? If I lend you the money, the cancellation date is in 3 months. So he says, I'll pay you back in 2 months. So really? What's your collateral? You know, got 100,000 shares in IBM? I mean, what have you got to back it up? He hasn't got it to back it up. The rich person's going to say, very likely I'm going to lose this money. Come back in 3 months. 3 months and a day. Then I have 7 years. Come back in 3 months. And there won't be money available for the poor. The Torah itself says, lest there be a perverse, wicked thought in your mind that the cancellation time is coming close and you're not going to lend. So the Torah anticipates this. So the legal situation is this. There's a law canceling the debt. There's one of the 613 commandments to lend money to people in need. The Torah itself says that if you deny people in need, you are a vicious criminal. And now there's a group of people saying, we're not doing both. We're not doing both. You enforce the cancellation, we're not lending money. Let the poor starve. We don't care. That's the legal motivation to do something. Within the Torah itself, this is not a bleeding heart liberal sentiment, oh, those poor people, let's do something for them. The Torah is hard-hearted. The Torah is short-sighted. The Torah is cruel. The Torah doesn't know how to deal with real social situations. We'll do something to modify the Torah to make it better than God made it. None of that. The Torah itself says you have to lend money to people in need. The Torah calls a person unwilling to lend vicious and cruel. That's the motivation. But that's not enough. That's only motivation. You need a legal leverage to make the change which will service the needs of the poor. And then I described to you the two different legal leverages that there are. When you have that description, I don't think you can use that as a basis for advertising that we can eat pigs. It just isn't true. If you can use that type of technique to make changes, then changes are made. They're made throughout Jewish history. Dramatic social change of major importance took place in the 20th century, first half of the 20th century, when schools, public schools, were invented for girls. Up until that time, girls were taught by their mothers at home. The only schools that existed, public schools, were boys. That we have for 2,000 years. You know what it means to create schools, divert resources, train teachers, a curriculum, a literature? And that was a social project that was undertaken from wall to wall. The whole of the religious community, within 10 years, changed its policy and made a social revolution. That's not a group of people who are stuck in the past, who can't make changes, but the changes have to fit this pattern. They have to fit this kind of methodology. So, when I was experimenting with conservative Judaism, I got that kind of argument. I didn't know anything. I went to people. I studied the Mishnah, the Talmud, the codes, the commentators, and all of a sudden, there's nothing left. There's no substitute for that. No substitute for doing the research on your own to have an opinion that you can defend and say that that's certainly not the way the enterprise works. So this is the framework of what I call the adequate reason for the Torah, for believing in the Torah. And the other things that I do from time to time is to reply to external critics like science, like philosophy, like sociology, like politics and things like that. And I have done a great deal of that, but that wasn't the subject of this series. So for my money, I'm finished with this series.